Hi, everyone. My name is attorney Christopher Bruce, and welcome to the podcast. Today, we're going to be with Staci Weiner. She's a licensed psychologist in Florida and New York, the owner of Apple Psychological. We're going to be talking about a very important topic, which is navigating divorce with a child on the spectrum. So, Staci, thank you so much for joining, being part of this, taking time from your day to be here. And, if you don't mind, just tell the listeners and viewers a little bit about your background and experience so that we can then get into this stuff.
Sure. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. So my name is Dr. Staci Weiner. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist as well as a certified school psychologist. And I have experience working with all different types of children, adolescents, adults, families, couples. And I've had extensive experience working with kids on the spectrum. And those experiences were in schools. They were as part of my private practice, which has been Apple Psychological, which has been around for 20 years, since 2005. So I have seen many families who have a child on the autism spectrum. And I really find it very rewarding to help educate people, whether it's parents or siblings or employers, just about what does it mean to be on the autism spectrum and how does that affect a child or a person's perception and the way that they see the world, because it's very different from how, neurotypical people see the world. The other way that I was working with people on the spectrum is through my job as an expert psychologist for Robson Forensic. So specifically, I worked on many cases with attorneys where a child or an adult was abused in some way or had some sort of traumatic experience. And so, unfortunately, very often we find that could happen with kids who have disabilities, specifically developmental and intellectual disabilities. And I find it very important to understand those nuances about how those kids and adults are impacted in terms of the trauma and how it can be viewed, and also a very different experience for those people as opposed to the neurotypical population.
I think there's a lot of different people that will be watching this. Some will be parents, some might be relatives, some might be, people. So maybe we can start from the top. What does it mean for a child to be on the spectrum?
Yeah, so being on the spectrum, it's a developmental disability. And very often those children or adults, they show difficulty with understanding social cues, with nonverbal behavior. They're often very rigid in terms of their routines and their expectations. They do not like change or disruptions in their life. So their routine's very, very important to them. People on the spectrum also have difficulty with relationships, making friends, maintaining relationships, and things of the sort. They often have specific interests. So something that, that they love, that they stick to and perseverate on a lot. And that could be difficult for parents, for people around them to understand and help them cope with life. They have a lot of challenges in processing and expressing their emotions. And as I was saying before about trauma, they experience things in a very different way. And often their inability to express themselves can come out in certain behaviors like tantrums or aggressive behaviors, or it's what we call stimming or repetitive statements. So there's many different ways they can get very sensory overloaded. So if there's too much information that's coming in at one time, their brain just can't handle that. And that's when we see the behaviors come out. So that's just some of of what it's like to be on the spectrum. Yeah.
In a moment, we'll get to, okay, parents are separating or getting divorced with a child on the spectrum. But I mean, just from your experience and the clinicians that you work with and working with children, which I know is a great deal, how does divorce or separation of parents typically affect just a child in general?
Yeah, I mean, so many things that I'm going to be talking about today really are good practices for kids on the spectrum and also neurotypical kids. It's just that, as I mentioned before about the challenges of kids on the spectrum, we really need to be especially careful and mindful of what we're saying to kids, how we're presenting the information, and really understanding their behaviors and knowing what to look for.
Yeah, so how does a typical child deal with their parents separating or divorce? What are kind of the basics that really any child's going to experience in that process?
Yeah, so first of all, it depends on the child, right?
Yeah.
It varies from person to person. There are some kids that go with the flow and they're, able to accept change more readily. There are other kids who are really rely on their routines and in order to feel safe. So it's a spectrum in terms of the neurotypical population as well. But I would say that in general, kids can be confused. They can be anxious because they don't know what to expect. And, they might not understand the reasoning behind the divorce or the separation. They could blame themselves for the divorce. So that's something that's really important to explain and talk to kids about. And they also can feel put in between. And this is what I found in my experience with working with kids whose parents are going through a divorce. Most often kids are loyal to both parents. Except in obviously there are certain situations where that's not true, but typically they love both their parents. They want both their parents to love them. And when you have two people who are contentious, they see maybe mom not liking dad or saying negative things about dad, and they might have a feeling about that. Or maybe one parent asks them about the other parent and they want to please their parents. So there's a lot of conflict there between, wanting to please the parent and also not wanting to go against the other parents. So I think even the most well-meaning parents, we're all human, right? And we all have our emotions. So I think it's important to just be mindful again of what you're saying to children and understanding that they love both the parents and, that they're going to have a hard time hearing negative things about the other partner, saying anything negative about the other partner.
Well, it sounds like from what you're saying that divorce can be, challenging in differing ways for really just about any child. A lot of care has to go into, how parents react and deal with their kids during the divorce process. But what about for kids on the spectrum? How is the divorce and separation process a little bit different for them?
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, in terms of kids being on the spectrum and their challenges, they often have difficulty processing information and expressing their feelings. That makes it difficult to talk about it, right? And sometimes the response that they have is not the typical response that you might think that a child would have. For example, sometimes kids on the spectrum might just act aloof or unaffected and kind of just shut down. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they are not affected. It just could mean they don't know how to interpret the situation. That's their response. Also, as I mentioned, many kids on the spectrum had difficulty with change and disruption in their schedule. And we know that with divorce comes changes in living arrangements, custody schedules, daily routines being disrupted. That can really result in heightened stress and anxiety for a child on the spectrum in particular. And just to say something about, my experience, I have had parents who, of course, take it personally if, let's say, a child doesn't want to come to their house and sleep over, and they say, well, why don't they want to see me? And it's important to understand if a child is on the spectrum and they have to go to a different house and pack their clothes and sleep in a different bed, and in the morning everything is different for them. Like for a typical child, that might not be an issue. They might just say, okay, I have my stuff, it's fine. But for a kid on the spectrum, each little change is highly stressful for them. So they might not choose to go to one parent or go to the other parent just because of the change and the rigidity in those routines, not because of how they feel about the parents. And I feel like that's a misconception that happens a lot. And then they might make their child feel like guilty or put pressure on them to come see them.
I've seen that play out more than a handful of times, and it's a tricky issue to deal with. And it really takes a parent that's pretty in touch with their child to not be affected by that. From my family's time getting to know you, I know you're not somebody to just highlight issues without giving some practical strategies to deal with them. So let's go through some of that. And where I think it usually starts is, okay, a parent, or ideally parents, have jointly decided that, the marriage is going to end or the relationship's going to end. And there does come a time to where, their child has to be told about that. And I know it can depend on the age of the child and some of the circumstances, but do you have any best practices for parents telling a child that is or might be on the spectrum about the divorce and what's going to be involved with it?
Absolutely. So first, we want to make sure that we use clear and concise language. And many kids on the spectrum have difficulty with abstract reasoning. So saying something like, we just grew apart, or, we don't want to be together anymore, something like that, will be very difficult for a child on the spectrum to really grasp and understand. So saying something else, such as, mom and dad will be living in different houses, but we still both love you and we're both going to be taking care of you, would be a much clearer way and much a better way for them to understand what is happening. There's also something called social stories, where I can get into that after and talk about an example of that.
I think that might be helpful. How can the social stories, I guess, approach or method help with, teaching a spectrum child or talking to a spectrum child about their parents' divorce?
Yeah, I'm going to give an example of a social story that could be used. It's really a short story that you're telling your child, and it's giving them the words to define what is happening and even helping them to label their emotions and just get a better understanding of what to expect. So a social story might be, my parents are getting divorced. What is happening? Sometimes parents decide to live in different houses. This is called divorce. My parents are getting divorced, which means they will not live together anymore. Even though they will live in different houses, they both love me very much. What will change? I will have two homes, one with mom and one with dad. I might spend time with each parent on different days. There will be a schedule to help me know where I will be. What will stay the same? Even though my parents will live in different places, they will always love me. I will still go to school and do my favorite activities. I will still see both parents. And I will still have my favorite toys or books or routines. How might I feel? It's okay to feel sad, confused, angry, or worried about the changes. If I feel upset, I can talk to mom and dad or another adult. I can use my emotion chart to show how I feel. An emotion chart is almost like a pie chart that has different emotions in it. So often kids can just pick which emotions, and they can pick more than one emotion if that's applicable. Then that helps them to label how they might be feeling at the time. I can take deep breaths or use my fidget toy, or I can ask questions if I'm confused. It's okay to have questions. If I'm unsure about something, I can ask and my parents will explain to me. Divorce is a big change, but I am loved and safe.
That makes a lot of sense.
So some other strategies to help kids understand the divorce process is to maintain consistency. So trying to keep those routines as stable as possible, even in different households. And that's challenging, as we know, with our clients, because, different people have different ways that they want to discipline, that they want to keep the house, what rules that they want to have for their children. But it's really important, especially for kids on the spectrum, to have that consistency in both homes. Using visual supports is sometimes helpful, having them use a schedule and understanding exactly like when's mom's day, when's dad's day, what do I need? Instead of just like, I don't know what's going to be happening, right? There's a lot of anxiety associated with that instead of, okay, now I understand where I'm going in every moment of the day. Providing clear and direct explanations. So we don't want to use that abstract language. We want to be straightforward about what exactly is happening. Validating their feelings, understanding if the child is sad or they're angry or they don't want to make the change or they want their parents to stay together, right? That's totally normal too. And that's with typical kids and also kids on the spectrum. And, work for parents to be working with the therapist and the support system and for everybody to be in communication about what the child is experiencing, what their challenges are, and the best way to help them.
Now, when it comes to the routine, and I've heard so much about this, both from, individuals in the mental health field, such as yourself and the parents of the child on the spectrum, is there a best practice for when the child's going to that new home, maybe with the parent that might not have been involved? We can say with the father, although it's the other way around. Less involved historically, parent out there that might be listening to this. Is there a best practice for trying to make the first few times their child comes into the home as successful as possible and laying a foundation for a healthy, visitation schedule as the divorce, starts to fade?
Sure. I would say we want to make sure that the child has a space of their own if possible, and also is able to bring some of their toys or things that they love if they're very little, like a blanket or a stuffed toy that they like as a transitional object to bring to the other home. And maybe also having the child's input in what that space would look like and sort of making it an exciting thing, right? Like, what do you want your new space to look like? Let's decorate it together so that they feel like really this is a home and it's not a foreign place that they have to go to. The more familiarity that they have, the better, the more comfortable that they feel.
Now, Staci, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is how does the role of a really good therapist play a part in helping a child on the spectrum adjust to the separation of their parents?
Yeah, therapist is extremely important to kids, to any child going through divorce, because even if two parents are well-meaning, loving, want to do what's best, they're still not objective in the situation, right? So the therapist provides a safe space where the child can feel free to talk about whatever they want to talk about. If they want to say something negative about a parent, positive about a parent, they can feel free to do so in that environment. It's also a consistent environment. I actually had a child on the spectrum that I was seeing for a few years, and we moved my office, actually. And he was very, very upset about that. Also, another time, I changed the date that he was seeing me. So he came at 7 p.m. on Wednesdays. Well, I was like, I have a meeting next Wednesday, so we're going to do Tuesday. That was a big problem. So they're very, very sensitive to those, as I said, routines and schedules and place. So in general, the therapy environment is a safe space where they can communicate freely. And also, therapy helps kids to communicate with their parents as well. The therapist can serve as a liaison between the child and the parent. If the child feels like too embarrassed or ashamed or is afraid that they're going to make their parent upset, the therapist can really help facilitate that communication, which is really important because a lot of times kids are holding in their feelings and they have a lot to say, but they just don't know how to say it, or they're afraid to say it for whatever reason. And that can affect everything. It can affect their behavior. It could affect even physical effects, stomach aches, headaches. So it could affect their sleeping and eating patterns. So it's really makes a very big difference when they have that liaison and that person that can help them communicate their feelings.
It makes a lot of sense to me. And I mean, I just know from, my clients that have gotten a really good therapist involved. If the child hasn't had one already in the divorce process, especially, the children that need extra attention, including the spectrum children, it really can make the process, I guess, at least a little bit smoother for really the entire family. So thank you for explaining that one and doing the work that you do. Now, what about the parents in this? I know in your practice, some of your clinicians work with the parents. Also, what are your best tips for them to balance the needs of their children, but also their own as they go through the divorce process, which isn't exactly just simple for them either?
It's really tough. It's really, really tough for parents. And the first thing I think that I would recommend is for parents to have their own therapists. They can communicate their feelings freely and have that space. And again, so they're not holding things in, which then come out in ways that they don't want them to come out. So, for example, yelling at their kids or not having a lot of patience or not understanding what their kids are going through. So having that therapist is really helpful for parents. Being really mindful of ourselves when we're getting angry, when we're getting sad, and being able to recognize that within ourselves really helps when we're working with our kids, because we don't want to be communicating with our kids when we're super angry or, really upset about something, right? Our brain is not really thinking clearly at that time. So it's important to know, okay, this is not the best time to deal with this. I need a time out, right? I need to take a break until I'm in a better space. And then I can talk to my child about what's happening or what we need to get through.
They need to hear the help of the people that are watching this. It doesn't matter how we do this. We could be upside down and it's gonna, help them. Or at least that's how I consume this stuff when it's something I need. But all right, so I'll ask this question. So Staci, for a child on the spectrum, I've had with some of my clients being really concerned about how a divorce will affect that child in the long term when they're an adult. And just from your experience and your research into this, do the parents have anything to be worried about here?
Well, I think it's really important for parents to recognize certain things in their children during this time, because we know that this is a sensitive period for any child. So the way that we can recognize maybe if they do need to seek out help, we want to look at, parents know their children, right? They know them better than anybody else, right? So really understanding that child's personality. Let's say they have things that they love, like sports or arts or gymnastics, right? And then during the divorce process or, after, they start not wanting to do those things that they used to really love a lot. That's really a sign okay, there's something going on here. Maybe there's something that they're not expressing. We want to look at the kids' eating habits and their sleeping habits. A lot of times these are things that are signs that there's an emotional issue going on. If we see regression in a child, so anything that they were normally doing that then they stopped doing, that's really important. And that's a sign that maybe we need to pay attention to something more that's going on with them. I have also seen a lot of kids blame themselves for the divorce and trying to figure out why is this happening? Why is my life being turned upside down, right? And so for kids who don't understand and process well, or if they're not being told concretely what's happening, they make it up in their own head what's happening.
Yeah.
And so, right, so they draw conclusions that, it's my fault. It's because when I went to the park, I didn't listen to my mom, and then dad got mad at mom, and now this is happening. So if I were to just listen to her, sometimes we don't even know that whole explanation until later, or until the child is in therapy and they explain that, and then, okay, now we can address it and help them understand, no, it's not your fault. It's that is not why this happened. So, this self-blame and low self-esteem we could also see as well. Kids can come up with certain ideas about, my parents didn't love me enough. Kids come up with all kinds of thoughts about things like that. And of course, we know that's not true. And we want to make sure, help kids understand that they're loved, they're going to be taken care of, and that's consistent, and that's never going to change.
Gotcha. I've got a question's a little off the script, so it's if we don't like it, we can it. But my familiarity with the research on children and divorce and just children in general is if there's a toxic environment in the household that, generally the children are going to be better off as adults if their parents separate, even if they don't effectively co-parent, than if that child were to continue growing up in the same intact but toxic household. Is that generally true for kids on the spectrum also?
Absolutely. I think it's true just in general. I think that a toxic environment, kids, whether they're on the spectrum or not, they're going to pick up on that negative energy. That's going to cause heightened stress. In the case of kids on the spectrum, it can cause behaviors, intense anxiety, and that tantrums, aggressive behavior, and these things can spill over into their performance and their functioning, their ability to perform in school or in work or their relationships. Yeah, I think a toxic environment is the worst scenario, worse than separation. And I just wanted to say one thing. It's really important. I like to look at the positives of situations because, look, life throws us curveballs all the time, right? It doesn't have to be that your child is just experiencing negative things. They can come out of this saying, wow, I handled this. I did this. It was a really, really hard time. And remember that time when I had to move all my stuff from here to here, and I had to go back and forth, and but now when life throws me another curveball, I'm prepared. I can do this. So there's a resiliency that can also develop in children, and I think that is nice for parents to hear as well, especially if they're in a toxic relationship. It's a negative environment for a child to understand that with therapy and, with support, kids can come out of this really well and healthy.
It's reassuring to hear, and I hope that sinks in for some of the people that might be listening to this. And I know we're getting closer to the end of the time, but I have one more for you, and that's for the parents that are concerned about their soon-to-be ex not being an effective co-parent with them. Just sometimes that's why people are coming to me to get divorced. For those people that feel pretty confident that the child's other parent is not going to be productive in attending to the needs of their spectrum child, but the reality is they're going to be seeing that child with the way the law works in many cases. Do you have any particular advice for that concerned parent on maybe some practical strategies they can do on their time with the child to, give their boy or girl the best chance of success in navigating this in the best way possible?
Yes. So we want to make sure that, first of all, the child understands what's happening. Where are they going? What will they be doing? Because if the other parent, let's say, isn't normally very involved in the child's life, or maybe doesn't have the skills that they need to be an effective parent, we want to make sure there's as much predictability as possible for the child so that they understand exactly where they're going, what they're doing, what time, when they're going to be home, how are they going to get home. So all these details are very, very important for children to understand. And an atypical child might think well, okay, I'll get home, it's fine. For kids on the spectrum, they really need to know these exact details and, what exactly is occurring. I would also recommend giving kids an outlet to say, if they have any concerns, about going to the other parent, without kind of leading them, don't you think it's bad to, So without doing that, just asking them if they're, how they feel about going to the other parents. Sometimes the one parent thinks it's going to be a disaster, but the child doesn't have any concerns. The child is fine with it. In that case, you don't really have that much to worry about, right? Because if the child's okay, right, then we want to be okay, right? Listening to your child, really being in attune with your child, and also acceptance, understanding, okay, the other parent is not going to do everything like you would do them. It's a hard thing to accept. So that might take some work, is to really understand, like, okay, the other parent doesn't have the skills that I have. They're not doing the things in the same way. And that's really frustrating and stressful for me, but they're keeping him safe. He's showing him love. He's doing these things, and that's supportive to the child, and really kind of wrapping their head around that.
Staci, thank you for taking the time to answer all of these questions and more from what we had talked about talking about. For those people out there that are listening to this and think that they could benefit from your expertise, maybe take a moment to tell everybody how to get in touch with you, explain your practice a little bit more. And, for those watching the video of this, there'll be links to all of Dr. Staci's information in the description. But if you could kind of explain how your process works and how you help people and their kids, I think that'd be great for the people taking part in this.
Absolutely. So we currently have 2 office locations. One is in Boca Raton, Florida, and the other one is in Roslyn Heights, New York, on Long Island. And we have a website, applespsychological.com, which I'm sure will be on your link that you have. And so you could book online, or you can call the office and schedule an appointment. And we do individual therapy, parent training. We also have a group called Pathways to Peace, a group for women who are going through the breakup of a long relationship or a separation or divorce. And that's starting soon, so sign up if you'd like. Also, we have a group called Adulting on the Spectrum. So it's 16 and up, and really kids who are struggling on the spectrum and struggling with independence, changes, going to college, or changing schools, or getting a job, or just figuring out next steps in their life. This group is a great group that people really bond together because they see people that have similar challenges that they have, with whether it's with understanding social cues or making friends, or just understanding the world and how to do different things as they're getting older and becoming adults. So it's a great group, and those you can find also on the website as well.
Well, Dr. Staci, thank you so much for being part of this. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, anytime.